The wooden bow of a ship gently beaches on the grassy shore of the Dnieper River. 4 siblings step out, 3 brothers and 1 sister. Hills as far as the eye can see, the perfect place to build a city. This stronghold would at one point become the second largest city at the center of the second most prosperous nation of Europe, Kiev. A settlement in the North Slavic region of Europe breaks free from Viking rule, led by a man named Rurik. The Rurik dynasty is based around the city of Novgorod in the northern part of modern-day Russia. This marks the beginning of the Rus. With a lack of Viking order, the many Slavic tribes of the region began to war with each other in a struggle for power. The Rurik were successful in conquering the lands south of them, including Kiev. By this time, Rurik had died and given way to his brother Oleg, who fell in love with the city so much that he made it his capital and rebranded his entire dynasty around it. This name change was followed by a period of great expansion that stretched the Rus from Poltava to the Baltic Sea, and gave them full control over the 3 major trade routes, the Volga, the Dnieper, and the Dniester. At this point, the Rus got a little cocky and decided to siege Constantinople. This event really put them on the map in a European sense, since before this, the Slavs had been seen as a people of little to no merit. Afterwards, the Byzantines even respected them, and allied with them later. The Byzantines were even known to hire Kievan mercenaries in battle. A few rulers pass, and we now welcome Vladimir the Great to the throne, who is asked by the Byzantines to help them with a rebel problem. In their agreement, the Byzantines would receive aid, while the Rus would receive material compensation in books, and would have to convert to Catholic Orthodoxy. This sparked a new wave of educated nobility, who had now access to Greek philosophy and sciences. As Vladimir dies, his son Yaroslav takes it upon himself to make the Rus a truly prosperous nation at the center of European politics, by marrying off his family members to the kings and princes of the Holy Roman Empire, Norway, Poland, Hungary, and France. He also establishes the first East Slavic law code, and builds the St. Sophia cathedrals, one in Kiev and one in Novgorod. A little lack of creativity in my opinion. Once the Crusades had begun, the Rus began to decline, since Europeans did not desire the Muslim tax products which were at the center of the Rus' trade. They survived one more ruler, Mstislav, but then fragmented as he died and the Mongol Turks of the Golden Horde invaded. Many principalities emerged from the ruined country, but the one to become ethnically Ukrainian was Galicia-Volhynia, who were forced to pay tribute to the Mongols for many, many years. Following several attacks by the Poles, the Galicia-Volhynians were brought under Polish rule for a short time, before they became the Polish-lithuanian Commonwealth. The Commonwealth built many cities and improved much of the infrastructure of the region, while also introducing serfdom, which was resented by many of the peasants. Many of the peasants, displeased with the practice, fled their homes and integrated with the Cossacks. The Cossacks are a people of debated origin, but they are descendants of the Slavic people and the Tatars of Crimea and the East. The Cossacks were a military-based society with a fighting spirit, which the Commonwealth saw potential in. They gave them military settlements along their eastern border to fend off Mongol raids. Although, putting a rebellious group of people together probably wasn't the best idea, since they revolted and declared themselves independent as the Cossack Hetmanate. After 5 years of brutal fighting, the Cossacks asked the Russians for aid, which sparked the First Polish-Russo War. The territorial gains from this war split the Ukrainians between the Russians and the Polish, and the Cossacks on the Polish side once again revolted, and once again the Russians sent aid, which sparked the Second Polish-Russo War. The territorial gains from this war had nearly united the Ukrainians, but they still lay divided between the Russians and the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs had declared war on the weakened Poland as well as the Russians. After the war, the Ukrainians had been denied their autonomy by the Russian Empire, which was promised at the beginning of the war. Not only this, but they had taken the weaponry from the militia and the Cossacks. So a few years pass, and there's this new guy in the French Empire, who is interested in the Ukrainian region. In particular, its economic advantageous potential of being a puppet state. A majority of the anti-Tsarist Ukrainians supported him as Napoleon conquered most of Europe. As the French neared the Russian border, the Tsar feared a Ukrainian uprising, so he began to print off anti-French propaganda, as well as enlist many Cossacks into his army. This gave a patriotic sense to the Russian name. Many Ukrainians even fought back under Napoleon's control. As winter set in, and the war was won, the Tsar disbanded militia and Cossack units, sending them into serfdom. Although, the Tsar did see potential in the Cossacks. As winter set in, and the war was won, the Tsar disbanded militia and Cossack units, sending them into serfdom. Although, he did maintain upkeep of a few, training them to be a secret police, to kill anyone against the Tsar, As Russia industrialized, this improved the farming capabilities of the Ukrainian lands, which were very fertile, and fed most of the Russian Empire, which sparked a wave of nationalism within the Ukrainian people. This Ukrainian nationalism only continued as the First World War began, and brothers had to fight brothers between the Austrian and the Russian empires. Thankfully, though, this fighting was cut short when the Russian Revolution began. The Ukrainians took this opportunity to declare independence as the Ukrainian People's Republic, and during the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, asked the Central Powers to protect them from the Soviets. These nations accepted the call for aid, but by the end of the war, when they had been losing, they renounced their treaties, and the Soviets took over. The Soviets attempted to implement their communist policies through collectivization of farms, but the Ukrainians refused to do so. The repercussions from this led to millions dying in the most gruesome event in Ukrainian history, known as the Holodomor. The USSR took all the grain from the people and closed off the borders so no one could get in or out. Millions died in one winter, between 1932 and 1933. The USSR publicly claimed that this was a naturally occurring famine, and that they had nothing to do with it. Many international communities sent food, but none of it got to the starving people. By the end of this devastating winter, many Russians were sent to resettle the area in the Russification. Soon after, the Second World War started, and the Ukrainians welcomed the Nazis with open arms, hoping for a positive change in rule. Some even joined a militia corps on behalf of them. But they were mistaken. The Nazis sent men to work camps. They destroyed buildings and extracted as much food as possible. Once the Germans had been repelled, the Ukrainians faced another famine from the scorched earth policies of the Soviets and the unforgivingness of the Nazis. Although, the Ukraine SSR did gain territory from Poland and Romania in Odessa and Lviv. And, to gain favor of the Ukrainian people, the USSR allowed the Ukrainian SSR to become one of the founding members of the UN. Once Stalin died, the successive rulers became more and more lenient, enacting de-Stalinization. The Ukrainian province was even gifted Crimea. But the terror of the USSR continued as the Chernobyl disaster occurred. This catastrophe rebirthed the anti-Soviet movement in Ukraine, and opened the citizens' eyes to the lack of proper management and leadership in the Soviet government. As the Soviet Union collapsed, the Ukrainian people gained independence, with an 80% turnout to the referendum and an 80% approval to leave the USSR. But, just as fast as the international community recognized the country, Ukraine faced an economic collapse that they didn't gain stability from until the end of the 90s. During a series of revolutions of former Yugoslav and Soviet territories fighting for a non-corrupt government, nicknamed the Color Revolutions, the Ukrainians had a rigged election in which they elected Viktor Yanukovych, in which a wave of corruption followed. Protesters flooded the streets of Kiev and demanded a revote and constitutional changes. They got what they wanted. But the man who they elected in, Viktor Yushchenko, was economically incompetent in a crucial time when Russia had cancelled gas exports. Another election comes by, and the more competent yet Russia-friendly Yanukovych is re-elected. He signs a treaty with Russia, saying that Ukraine will be more amiable with them and less with the EU, which greatly displeases the people. Protests ensue, known as the Euromaidan, which incites the government to pass anti-protesting laws, which gives the military authority to kill those protesting. Many innocent lives died at the hands of these laws, but the protesters fought back. The next day Yanukovych fled Ukraine, and the people held another election. While the people were preparing for the next election, Putin marched his troops into the Crimean Peninsula and stationed them near voting polls during a very controversial referendum, the result of which made Crimea Russian. The successful pro-European riots enraged the pro-Russian people of the Donbass region, who, with heavy Russian aid and backing, revolted in a very violent manner. The Ukrainian government responded by sending the military there, in which a stalemate is stuck till this day. In very recent events, the Russians stationed in Crimea were not allowing Ukrainian ships to enter or exit the Sea of Azov. Eventually, they fired upon 3 Ukrainian ships, taking their men prisoner, and claiming that they were violating Russian waters, in direct contradiction to the bilateral treaty stating that the passage was shared. The future of Ukraine is paved with uncertainty, but one thing that is certain is that the Ukrainian people are used to having foreign blood on their soil. Fighting is in their blood. Stay hydrated, ladies and gents.